Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Prime Minister is well informed, and I'm sure he pays heed to what is being said outside this very house. And there is an outcry largely due because government has been indifferent and insensitive to the voice of the people. And the people have spoken, and they have conveyed their messages loud and clear to us. I've had the opportunity to listen to trade union, people from the formal or informal sector, in fact, from people from all walks of life. And there is a common thread in relation to what they say and what they want us to convey to our friends sitting on government bench, and especially to the Prime Minister. And what is the appeal? The appeal to Prime Minister is to give more time to study the provisions of the bill, to study the merits, if any, but certainly to look at the demerits of the bill. And it's good to listen to what the people are saying. There is an outcry. And had it not been for the easing of the lifting of the confinement, people would have started to show their discontent, and probably many would have been voicing out and express their dissatisfaction. And I will come back to the advice that I tendered to government following the question which I put as far back as the 3rd of February. And I reminded the government, and I was not the only one, others, like my good friend, Honorable Dr. Omir. Any two of you in L'Express made it quite clear that we were on the verge of a pandemic. And we reminded government and the country of an impending pandemic. And we called, and I was not the only one, Honorable Xavier-Luc Duval also, called for closure of border when France became an epicenter. Earlier, Prime Minister was saying that had it not been for the unflinching support of the population, things would have been different. And I totally agree. But then, had it been a government which had honesty and seriousness of purpose, things could have been better. And I'm not going to refer to reports submitted or to statistics that have been circulated, but the fact remains that we have the highest mortality rate in the Indian Ocean. The fact remains that amongst the 10 best countries in Africa in relation to management of the outbreak or pandemic, Mauritius is neither here nor there. But we are not here to make comparisons. We are here to convey a message loud and clear to the government. And in a pandemic or post-pandemic, government never walks alone. It needs the trust of the people. And to have the trust of the people, even those who had differences with the Prime Minister. On that day of reckoning, they say, let us set aside our differences. And even the former Prime Minister wrote a letter to the Prime Minister to inform him of his goodwill, of the good intention to rally, because the object was to wage war on an insipid, on an invisible virus, and which is deadly. So I appeal again. Set aside our differences because the country comes first. But I'm not talking on behalf only of members of the opposition. Go and listen to the voice of reason. Listen to the people. They are afraid because of infringements upon personal liberty. Because there is no common thread in respect of the way and manner we are going to deal, and God spare us, a second pandemic or a surge in the coronavirus. Mr. Speaker, sir, and I appeal again to Prime Minister to give us time. And you know, when we were in government, when we were to introduce the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, we paid heed to what the former Chief Justice had to say. And we did not move the bill. It was not introduced in the House. Today, the psyche is different. If the executive has failed to pay heed to a legitimate request from a retired Chief Justice to be given 13 days to finish pending cases, I doubt it, Mr. Speaker, if it will respond to appeal. And people are worried. They are worried because they have jobs to go to. They're worried because tomorrow they don't know whether the jobs will be there. They're worried because of their families. They're worried because they don't know whether tomorrow they'll have 1 meal or 2 meals on the table. And I do also take on board that we have to finance the cost of a bailout. And precisely the reason why we need to come together. We need to have dialogue, consultation. And the request is coming from all quarters, trade union, NGO, and as I said earlier, people from formal and informal sectors. People want to be heard, and they want the truth. The truth is trust, Mr. Speaker. But the government, unfortunately, behind the veneer of COVID-19, has chosen to be provocative. And the blunders are looking at us. And the biggest blunder which government is making is to peg the balance sheet of the Bank of Mauritius to the revenue and expenditure of government. But it does not stop there. In fact, it wants a plain sailing. But wait, the debt ceiling has been removed. It now has a passport to spend taxpayers' money, I hope not recklessly. And the Minister of Finance has been given the discretionary power to decide who he wants to be exempted from non-payment of COVID levy. If he decides that some firms close to power should be given special treatment, he can make regulation to exclude any category of employers from the levy. The regime is arrogating itself power beyond its wildest dream. Bank of Mauritius has become a lender of first resort, a big player, and a regulator to be sought after. Unfortunately, whose strings are pulled by government. 1 more week. What's in a week? A week is not always a long time in politics, Prime Minister. But it may be if there is a legal and political crisis. These 2 bills have the potential to lead to a crisis. No one wants a social crisis to be engineered. There is public outcry. While the government is fiddling and opting for creative accounting, people want to know if they have jobs to go and food on the table. Let me, Mr. Speaker, say a few words to the young Minister of Labour. And he has a moral and legal obligation to inform workers that they will not forego their rights. May I remind the Minister that in this very House, he hailed the workers as the unsung hero of the workforce. Zot Kimari. That was said in this very House. What was it? A pure electoral gimmick? Was it an electoral bribery? Don't forget, electoral petitions are before the court to contest the legitimacy of this government. People have already made up their minds. The days of this government are counted, Mr. Speaker. They may laugh, but I'm the one who's going to have the last laugh in this House. Mr. Speaker, I impress upon government not to use COVID as an excuse to be the lackey of the conglomerate. Burden has to be shared. And where there are rights, there are obligations. In Canada, government is hiking wages for essential workers, whereas in Mauritius, we are referring these cases to the redundancy board. Even if there's temporary technical layoff, they should preserve the rights. I can understand that we all call upon to make sacrifices. They may forego some privileges, not basic salaries and rights when the economy kickstart. Under worst circumstances, I refer to the appeal made by the Pope to give universal basic income. But of course, when he talked of universal basic income, he had in mind those who are at the lower rung of the ladder. Call it universal basic income or an employment scheme, by whatever name, an employment hardship relief scheme, but we need to be supportive of those who are at the lower rung of the ladder. And they should not negotiate fresh conditions and give up on acquired rights. I have a list of proposals made by trade unions who are indeed acting in the interests of the country. And Section 72 of the Workers' Rights Act has to be revisited. Leave without pay is a license to redundancy. Who will be the first to lose their jobs and acquired rights? What are we being told when we look in the schedule? The frontline workers from the Ports Authority, the customs, and the refuse disposal. In fact, it applies to any worker, Mr. Speaker, who has sweated to keep his company growing and going. Our people are intelligent, easygoing, tolerant, but when they arise, awake, they will stop not to claim their legitimate rights. And I'm not saying things, for the BS, for the mere purpose of saying it, but beware of a popular tsunami, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would advise the Minister of Finance to have some culture of restraint and don't threaten this country with an apocalyptic scenario. This is not the first crisis that the country is facing, but I grant you it is unprecedented. We face the quadruple crisis, financial, food, fuel, feed crisis in 2008, 2010. But we had the fiscal space to save jobs and enable companies not only to stay afloat, but to be restructured and to deliver on time. Fear should not be instilled. Beware of basic instinct reflex. This is the day of reckoning, and those who subscribe to the provisions of this bill are making a big mistake. And I'm sure some of our friends sitting on the government bench are being tormented. Because if they are going to be supportive of these two bills, then they are departing from their principles. I'm not going to drop the names, but they know who they are. For the mere pleasure of power, you cannot set aside your principles and your belief. And I appeal to them to exercise influence upon Prime Minister, to revisit these two bills. It can be done. I'm sure there are people of goodwill sitting on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, I must say I don't usually watch the national television, but when the Attorney General was on television, I must say he was there, of course, to highlight the merits of the two bills, but he was more dissuasive than persuasive. And he reminds me of General Pinochet of Chile, who gave orders, and those who did not comply were shot. Here, thanks God, we don't shoot them, but we send them to jail. And what was his forte? Repressive measures. Big Brother is watching, and anyone who inadvertently contravenes Section 79A shall be liable to a fine not exceeding 200,000 rupees and to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years. I have the impression that the Attorney General, unfortunately, lives in cuckoo's land and doesn't realize that the basic salary is 10,000 and there are people who are heavily indebted and cannot even have a meal a day. The fines are disproportionate. I need to have to refer to rulings given by the Privy Council or by the European Court of Justice. You cannot apply disproportionate fine because it is a flagrant violation of rights. The fines are disproportionate. And if it is not 200,000 rupees for curfew violation, it is 500,000 rupees as stipulated in the Quarantine Bill in Section 12. Section 11 gives unfettered powers to the police officer. Mr. Speaker, we are at war against an insipid and deadly virus. But for God's sake, make our people potential foot soldiers, allies, and not treat them as enemies of the state at a time when they're having a foretaste of the lifting of the lockdown. This is a democratic country and not a police state. Neither police nor law-abiding citizen should be above the law, but the law is an us. That's why the letter and the spirit of the law should not be poles apart. Do you know that the fine in UK, Mr. Speaker, has been increased? Yes, but it has been increased from £50 to £100, 5,000 rupees. And in France, it is equally reasonable. Section 45 of the Public Health Act is anti-constitutional, and a criminal offense cannot have retroactive effect. Some people are asking, are these disproportionate fines a way for government to collect indirect taxes? Is government so hard up that it will fleece the population? An increase of fine from 500 rupees to 20,000. Mr. Speaker, the police has been given unfettered powers when I refer to Section 11 of the Quarantine Bill. He breaks into the place and he doesn't need a warrant. There is no need to seek a warrant from a deputy superintendent of police or magistrate. And the police officer acts on mere suspicion, hearsay. They call it reasonable cause, on instruction, and can, if he wants, manu militari, drags the alleged offender from his place. The person may be threatened even if he exercises his right to silence. After all, we still have the picture of a prisoner who was brutally assaulted and died while being transferred from Beaubassin to La Bastille. This is the image people have of this government and it has arrogated itself unfettered powers. Under the cover of a pandemic, no responsible government should convert lockdown and sanitary measures into draconian laws. Besides, although it serves a purpose, but even the QR code has made it easy to track any person, and the right of privacy is being infringed. The COVID and quarantine bill falls short of expectation in that respect. It is inevitable that in the exercise of powers under the bills, decision will be made for the wrong and unlawful decisions. Aggrieved persons must be able to challenge such decisions on fast-track basis to seek redress. Unfortunately, there is no provision in the bill, especially the quarantine one. That's why I appeal again to Prime Minister to dissipate the perception, which is a mirror image of reality, and enter into dialogue with all stakeholders and disseminate information to the public. Face the public, Mr. Prime Minister, before they face you. There is an outpouring of anger. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a public health emergency. And the primary focus of government should be on public health, medical evidence, and research, and not on disproportionate repressive fines and sentencing. Go to jail and spend 5 years for an act which may be inadvertent. I know of a citizen who was copiously insulted because he had to visit his child whose ex-wife had custody of, and he's yet to obtain a permit. But what about lawyers who are charged of breaking curfew regulations which were poorly drafted? And if we're not for a ruling from the ex-Chief Justice, lawyers, doctors, chemists would not have been able to exercise their rights. And God protect them if they swear allegiance to the opposition. But of course, these days, I don't see anybody swearing allegiance for government. Not even a shadow, Mr. Speaker. Do you know how long it takes for a work access permit to be processed? This is why, if you remember, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, I insist on a protocol, on options, on deadlines, on timelines. We have to live a near-normal life, and physical distancing and sanitary measures have become a way of life for the duration of the outbreak. No one wants to waste a good crisis. This is why we impress upon government to recall Parliament. The executive cannot act unilaterally and by way of regulations, amend main legislation. And when we look at the bill, since I'm talking of regulations which need to be amended, even the definition of quarantine or self-isolation have not been defined or mentioned in the quarantine bill. The scrutiny of Parliament, Mr. Speaker, is the backbone of democracy. And it was Sir Winston Churchill who said, a government which runs a country by regulation, by 1,000 regulations, is on the road to dictatorship. Mr. Speaker, an omnibus COVID bill is an exceptional, and it is not a normal bill. And sometimes amendments are surreptitiously introduced while everyone has the ears and eyes on more pressing matters to be flogged and flagged. And government is openly introducing an amendment to the main act, the Pharmacy Act, to leverage the case of a doubtful entrepreneur who is keen to set up a pharmaceutical company in Mauritius to manufacture tablets only to supply hospitals and domestic market. Forget about good manufacturing premises, but of course his application will be fast-tracked. It is a lucrative business of 400 million rupees out of a total budget of 1.3 billion earmarked for purchase of drugs. The Association of Pharmacists have been very critical of this amendment proposed in relation, as I said earlier, to good manufacturing premises and quality control. Mr. Speaker, again, it was done when we had debate on the 2019-2020 finance bill. And we alerted public opinion on the raiding of the Bank of Mauritius. And what are they doing today? When you lump the balance sheet of the Bank of Mauritius and government, for reasons which, of course, are obvious, this is tantamount to a raid of the central bank. I'm not going to talk of total public debt or projects which one called for could have been shelved, and today the maintenance costs that appears to be excessive, but somewhere, somehow, somebody has to pay for the costs. While the future of the staff of Air Mauritius is uncertain, a lot of money is going into the payment of projects which could have been uncalled for. Of course, there are lessons to be learned from this pandemic. We have to cut our cloth accordingly. We have to cut down on wastage, and people in the state have to adapt, because if we don't, we will perish. No one is against monetizing public debt, Mr. Speaker. In fact, that has been canvassed by a former Minister of Finance and who was also Minister of Foreign Affairs of India, Yashwant Sinha, and who is a strong proponent of fiscal responsibility. But he said, in times of crisis, you can monetize debt, but it has to be limited. It has to be town-bound. It has to be volume-bound. Otherwise, the independence of the Bank of Mauritius is undermined. And this government has raided the central bank, turned it into a development bank with no oversight, and in fact, it has become a player. The regime is using the tyranny of numbers, as I said, to turn the central bank into a development bank, and has also got rid of public sector debt. This is manipulation, and it goes against provisions clearly spelled out by financial institutions. What government has done or intends to do is to turn triangage into triangage légal, allegedly to slower debt. But it didn't have a mandate from the electorate to undermine the independence of the Bank of Mauritius. What they've done, they've dented a reputation which has already been undermined. So, Speaker, even when it comes to public sector debt, again, maneuverings, cut corners, turning what we call gross public debt into net basis, using cash equivalents. But this is the way this government has run this country, trying to cut corners with the consequences that we will be wrapped on the knuckle by a financial institution. And we have paid a price for this. When you lose your credibility, earlier Honorable Xavier Duval was talking of other jurisdictions having a second look at us because competition is fierce, and if they have to run you down, they will do so. Forget about those to whom we've subscribed for better oversight. They won't leave us in peace. And this is the problem when you cut corners, when you do away with obligations which you have signed and subscribed to, talking of international conventions. we have a price to pay. But then this debt adjustment for what we call the non-financial public sector bodies holdings, they were queried here by the Director of Audit in his latest report. It is also considered by independent economic observers as an artifice to artificially reduce public sector debt. And by this amendment, the non-financial service bodies, public service bodies, is being made, this adjustment is being made legal. Just to cut the story short, it's like deducting money in your wallet from your debt without taking on board all your other liabilities. But a debt is a debt, Mr. Speaker, sir. And therefore, I impress upon government to tread cautiously and to err on the principle of caution. It has no mandate, as stated earlier, to depart from established economic indicators unless international donors and institutions change the parameters. Section 6 of the Bank of Mauritius Act is amended. And the provision of direct finance to government, as stated, is limited. There is restriction on how much government securities can hold, except for certain specific and limited purposes, shall not exceed 20% of the average of government revenue in the last 2 years. And it goes against the spirit of the Bank of Mauritius Act to extend finance to private companies for facilitating economic development. It is meant to supervise, regulate credit institutions, complement and compete with them in providing credit to the private sector. Mr. Speaker, as I stated earlier, government in times of need or when there's a crisis, when there's a force majeure, can monetize debt. But I will stress upon what I say. It has to be time-bound. It has to be volume-bound. We need to make sure that there's proper ring fencing and there is proper oversight. But we have a Bank of Mauritius which is not accountable to Parliament, but it is answerable to a board, and unfortunately handpicked by government with political allegiance, and its members are like Iran boys and girls. Do you see the governor of Mauritius standing up to the Minister of Finance? But they've both been lucky, and they struggled from the time they left a mess at the Financial Service Commission. Mr. Speaker, Bank of Mauritius cannot pander to the whims and caprices of government. This power under Section 2 of the Miscellaneous Provisions COVID Bill cannot be delegated to the Bank of Mauritius, and there's no reason to rush it through. Government is falling on public money without consent from the public, and they don't even have the right to do so. But when you turn the Bank of Mauritius into a printing machine, we know what the consequences are. Today, when I put the PNQ to our good friend, the Honorable Minister of Good Governance, I should have reminded him that 56% of deposit in our bank are in foreign currencies. And what message is being conveyed? On one hand, you're printing. You've turned Bank of Mauritius into a printing machine for reasons allegedly to pay local debt, and consequences that the rupee is being depreciated, and those who have to export or to import, when they go to the bank, they are told there's no dollar. My good friend is a great businessman, great exporter of pineapple, and he exports good quality pineapple. But he knows very well, that things are not as good as they used to be. Today, the rupee is depreciating, and by the end of the year, it will be depreciated by more than 25%. There will be a galloping inflation and an increase in the cost of living, and if nothing much is done, you'll have many people who will probably lose their job. And you know what poverty is? It can become absolute poverty. Those who are the middle class will be trapped, and the gap between the haves and the have-not will widen. May I remind our friends that we should not go the Zimbabwe way. Also today, in relation to our jurisdiction, which used to be the pride of this country, today we are squeezed between Zimbabwe and Panama. This is the fate of Mauritius under this government. And may I remind our friends that Zimbabwe used to be the breadbasket. Harare was the London of Africa. Today, Zimbabwe is a basket case, and if you don't have a dollar or the African rand, you cannot walk into the shop, let alone to purchase a sweet. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, I would advise government to tread cautiously, to err on the principle of caution, to comply fully with commitments given to international organizations. We have subscribed to many international rules and regulations. We are signatories to these rules and organizations. So let me, Mr. Speaker, impress upon government that it has to be clear with respect also to the COVID-19 development program. How is this going to be set up? Where is the money going to come from? We are told that, of course, there will be disbursement from the Bank of Mauritius. Government probably will contribute, but we have to be told what is the purpose of the COVID Development Fund program. What will it serve? So, Mr. Speaker, I also wish to draw attention to the plight of small and medium-sized enterprises. Entrepreneurs are complaining, and they want to know whether they would need to reimburse the wage assistance allowance that has been given to them. Notwithstanding that minister has the discretionary power to exempt those whom he deems fit to be exempted. Now, I would also ask the minister to establish a list of companies with high debt, high margin, high debt, low margin, no debt, high margin. Why I'm saying that? At least there would be transparency in relation to clawing back. Because many of those conglomerates, I know many of them have not opted to take any assistance from government, but some others have done. And it is not because one of the interrelated parties are facing undue difficulties, despite the fact that some of them pay huge dividend to shareholders, that they should be exempted. I take it for granted that this will be looked into, but at the same time, we should not allow any conglomerate to exercise undue influence and threaten that workers will be laid off with the risk that their subsidiaries may have to cease their activities, because the principal objective of dispensing support, of allocating financial resources to private sector, especially those to whom especially those who have benefited from huge fiscal incentives. As I say, today the burden has to be shared. The objective is to keep enterprises afloat, but to safeguard as many jobs as possible, with special and differential treatment given to medium and small businesses. Mr. Speaker, what we need to do and what message do we have to convey to the young generations and the generations to be? We have to convey loud and clear to them that the money that is being used will be used judiciously. Because at the end of the day, they are the one who will have to bear the burden. They are the one who will have to carry this debt burden. But if money is being dispensed and used judiciously, and there is a trade-off, a counterparty, with respect to equity participation, and government can pull out as and when, subject that the enterprises have started to make profit, that money can be used for better purposes and would ease off the burden placed upon this generation and generation to come. So that's why I told Prime Minister, I'm telling all of us here, convey message, interact, interface. Make sure that message is heard, but let people voice out their feelings. If you don't do so, and you restrain yourselves from doing so, beware of social chaos. And I know what I'm saying. I'm not saying it for the pleasure of threatening or of conveying the wrong signals. I'm saying it par connaissance de cause, Mr. Speaker. And I've talked to many people. Irrespective of color, creed, people are angry because of uncertainty. They don't know what the future holds. Post-pandemic, what would they do? Where would they go? Would they be able to pay the debts? And the bills would start to pile up. And when they wouldn't be able to pay, to honor their commitments, because they don't have the means to do so, you can expect things to be sour. What would you do then? Arrest people, make arbitrary arrests, send them to jail. Is this the concern of government? Is this the interest of this government by moving those to legislation? Government has to be caring, and government should voice out and listen. This is why I say, Mr. Speaker, sir, there are sacrifices to be made, but the burden has to be shared. Sacrifices cannot be vain, and these sacrifices have to be shouldered equally and equitably, Mr. Speaker, sir. But at the same time, this world is awash with liquidity, with hedge fund. The country which is able to manage the pandemic with least consequences or outcome of this pandemic. Let me tell you one thing, Mr. Speaker. Sovereign funds and hedge funds, which are awash with liquidity, they will seek jurisdiction where opportunities are knocking. If we get our act right, if our reputation as a jurisdiction is not tarnished, if we are able to mobilize our resources, turn things around, take appropriate measure, this post-pandemic is an opportunity which is knocking. But we have to convey signals to the international community, to relevant institutions. This is an opportunity for a new social and economic contract. And it is time to invest massively in green and blue economy, in smart agriculture, in education and health sectors. And I will quote what the respected economist and former governor of Reserve Bank of India stated. Capital will go to economies which are well managed and less battered by COVID-19. This is a statement of fact. And it does not come from me, but it comes from somebody who's highly respected, the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. That's why I impress upon government to sort out the mess that they've landed this country into. You cannot exercise undue influence upon the central bank, whose reserves are limited. We are not the Federal Bank of America. If you do so, if you're in full compliance with criteria set by international organizations, it's an opportunity which is knocking, and we can attract investment in this country. As he said, all sovereign funds and hedge funds will be awash with liquidity, and this crisis is an opportunity. But then government has to be like Caesar's wife, above all suspicion. But this is a different case. And not all the perfumes of Arabia or the holy waters of the Ganges will wash their hands, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, I've talked about the Bank of Mauritius, the good oversight, transparency. Let me now say what we can do. Whether we like it or not, notwithstanding the right, subject to amendment which need to be brought, to use limited amount of money from special reserves of the Bank of Mauritius to contain our debt and to finance the bailout package. We also have to turn to the IMF. Many countries are doing so. But we can do better with a special reserve fund. And we have Mauritians who are experts in private equity. Monsieur Delaporte, Mr. Roy, Ashwin Roy. These are people who can deliver and can set up special purpose vehicle. Get Bank of Mauritius to transfer money to that special purpose vehicle as seed capital. And they know how to multiply it. But subject, of course, that you get the right people who can manage this special reserve, this special purpose vehicle. It can be done. We don't have necessarily to lay our hands on the coffers of the Central Bank of Mauritius, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I talk of the COVID Projects Development Fund, and I'm sure Prime Minister today, when he sums up, or the Minister of Finance will highlight the relevance of this fund. On the Finance and Audit Act, we are told that the limit has been extended to 15 billion rupees. And I hope the Minister of Finance will tell us how this money is going to be used, for what purpose, how it will help to ease off burden, because this is taxpayers' money. But on the other hand, there is an explanation which we are yet to have from the Minister of Finance. And many questions have been asked, but the replies to the question have not been forthcoming. I have in mind the 18 billion rupees from the special Reserve Fund, the $7 billion which has been used to prepay the African Bank Development, the $11 billion which we don't know where it is, whether it is in a special account at the Bank of Mauritius, or whether it has been used to honor other commitments. But we have to be told, why is it that there's only $7 billion in the Special Reserve Fund? Xavier-Luc Duval liked to say that money is fungible. Fungible, yes, but we have a right to be told, where is the 18 billion rupees? In whose pocket is it? I'm not going to lay my hands in somebody's pocket to find out, Mr. Speaker. But we need to find out where is the money. You cannot go on a spending spree and say that the world belongs to you and you're using other people's money. It is the people's money, and the people have the right to know where that money has gone. Mr. Speaker, sir, we cannot take things for granted. It is not because you have the power, because you have the number rather than the power, that you think you can exercise the tyranny of numbers. It is not because a single majority will get those 2 bills through that you can take things for granted. Out there are people who are angry. Out there, people won't let you get away easily. They want answer, they want transparency, they want accountability. That's what people want, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me now come to the Quarantine Act. The Prime Minister has been saying earlier that we rigidly apply the provisions of the law in relation to quarantine. But you know the blunder made by the Minister of Health and the Director of Social Services to take the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister to a quarantine in non-compliance of what we call protective personal equipment. You know the risk that you expose the Prime Minister to and the Deputy Prime Minister. In other countries, probably the Medical Council, they would have taken action against the Minister of Health. You don't do that, not for the sake of bowing to what the Prime Minister wants you to do. It was a great risk, and it was a bad example set. Like, without giving advance notice, this government decides to close the borders with so many people stranded. And they are desperate. Some of them don't even have a roof over their head. Some even don't have food to eat because they don't have the means. And you know how difficult it is to have this loan, which is supposedly easy to have access to. And there are people in Maldives eager to travel to Mauritius, willing to charter a plane, but have been refused landing rights. Is this the way we treat our citizens? We have an obligation vis-à-vis our citizens. That's the reason why I went to see the president, who is the custodian of our Constitution. And I told him, as President of the Republic, he has a moral and legal obligation to protect the citizens of this country. We are still waiting. And quarantine centers are empty. But we refuse to give landing rights to those who are stranded in Miami. The time has come to act wisely, and to act with a humane dimension. What's the point of being human beings if we are not humane, Mr. Speaker? And it's time to remedy. It's time to redress. It's time to make mea culpa. We cannot leave our citizens stranded, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have said what has to be said in a language which I think is clear. I speak the language of the common man because I want the message to be conveyed that this government has failed to deliver on promises made to the workers. They promised to turn this country into an El Dorado. Instead, there's every chance of Mauritius sliding from an alleged upper middle income status, probably to God knows what. But there is the will in this country to turn things around. But to turn things around, you need to mobilize all the people. You need to chalk out clear-cut strategies, and you need to establish a roadmap. Bring people together. There are people who are willing to help to turn things around. My appeal to this government, and it's never too late. A week is not a long time in politics, Mr. Prime Minister. Listen to the voice of the people. Bring the necessary amendments that have to be brought in this legislation. Let the voice of the people be heard. Thank you very much.